It's Saturday, August 8th. My name's Juan Brown. You're watching the Blancolirio channel, and it's time for a brief update on the Air India Express 1344 mishap that occurred yesterday, 7 August, 7:41 local time at the tabletop airport of Calicut International Airport, India. Today it's being reported that there were 184 souls on board the aircraft total, the 737-8NG aircraft. At this time they are reporting 18 fatalities. 2 of the fatalities include both pilots. 127 injuries. 4 of the crew members, cabin crew, survived. Both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder have already been recovered. We talked about many of the things investigators are going to be looking at in this accident. The weather combined with the treacherous nature of this airport made this approach and landing especially demanding. Again, regarding the airport, they're going to be looking at the RCR, or runway condition reading reporting system, where the pilots and crew getting accurate data as to the actual runway condition reading, how much water was actually on the runway. Was the runway properly maintained as far as removal of rubber deposits? Were all the lights working on the runway at the time? The instrument approach procedures, were all the different instrument approach procedures in operation at the time? And of course the basic design of the airport with the huge drop-off at the end, and the very unfortunate design which I see so commonly around the world, is a solid wall, a security wall, right off the departure ends of the runway. And that, I'm afraid, is what killed the 2 pilots, is when the nose section of that aircraft separated from the rest of the airplane and it was thrown up against that solid wall. Investigators will also be looking at the configuration of the aircraft. Initial reports are indicating that the ground spoilers appeared to be in the stowed position as they were rescuing folks from the airplane. The ground spoilers are those flaps, if you will, the big barn doors on the top of the wings, which should automatically deploy on landing and stand straight up, destroying the lift on the wing and allowing the braking system maximum efficiency. According to some pilots that operate out of that airport, the Calicut Tabletop Airport is a special requirements airport. It is a captain's only landing airport because of the demanding nature of landing there. That also means it requires special training and occasional sim recurrency training on landing at that airport. And at this airport on the 737, this airport requires a flaps 40 landing, a full flap landing, and brakes 2 or 3, but in this situation, given the weather and conditions, the crew should have selected auto brakes max. Investigators will be looking at the aircraft to see what the configuration of the aircraft was when they landed. Other factors include scheduling, pilot fatigue, what was the prior 72 hours of the pilot's life like. I've got some fairly current Jeppesen approach plates for this airport we can share with you at this time. If we look at the airport diagram itself, we see that the published actual runway length is 9,383 feet at an elevation of 315 feet with very little slope. It's showing that it does have the proper approach lights for a precision instrument approach system. And if you look at the usable landing distance beyond the glide slope for runway 10, that is down to 7,886 feet. That's what you need to compare your landing distance calculator distance to, not the 9,383 feet, but the usable distance beyond the glide slope of 7,886 feet. Initial reports are indicating that this crew landed 1 kilometer, or about 3,200 feet down the runway. 3,200 feet down the runway puts this airplane outside of the desirable landing zone. If the glide slope brings you down to a point of 7,866 feet remaining, that means the desirable landing spot is only 1,497 feet from the beginning of runway 10. Looking at the FlightAware data, it does look like the crew did attempt an approach to runway 28. The granular data on FlightAware looks like they were attempting a non-precision approach to runway 28. Remember, instrument approaches are broken down into precision approaches and non-precision approaches. This runway has published precision approaches to both runways, 10 and 28, and both of those approaches, the minimums for the precision approach brings the aircrew down within 250 feet of the ground. Remember, an instrument approach allows you to fly on instruments without reference to the ground until you reach a point and an altitude in space, at which time you must see the runway environment before you can proceed on to the landing. If you reach your missed approach point or decision altitude, depending on what type of approach you're flying, and you do not see the runway environment, you have to go around. It looks like this crew came in from Dubai, did the procedure turn for runway 28. It appears to be a non-precision approach, which adds us another level of complexity to the already demanding task at hand, and then does a missed approach to come around and land on runway 10 from the other direction, which put the crew in a tailwind situation. Again, from the granular data on FlightAware, it looks like the crew was able to get the ground speed while doing the approach to runway 28 into the wind. They were able to get their ground speed down to about 150 knots, a reasonable ground speed. However, because they couldn't see the runway, is what we're assuming, they went around. Now, if we look at the approach minimums for both runway 28 and 10, we talked about the precision approach minimums are about the same. They bring you down to about 250 feet from the ground. But if the glide slope is out of service, the glide slope is that portion of the instrument approach which brings you down on a glide path, a steady 3-degree glide path, right down to the runway. If that glide path is inoperative, you have to fly a non-precision approach. In other words, you have to step down to your altitudes unless you are able to build an approach in VNAV with the 737 FMS. That's another story for another time. And if you look at the approach minimums of runway 10 versus runway 28 for the non-precision approaches, you see that the runway 10 minimums are much lower than the runway 28 minimums. In other words, the runway with the tailwind component has a much lower minimum, so that allows the crew to get down lower and closer to the runway to see the runway to land by choosing to do the non-precision approach on runway 10. So investigators are going to need to be able to figure out exactly which approaches was this crew flying, which procedures were they using. And this may help determine why did the crew choose to land on runway 10 with such a strong tailwind component. Thanks again for your support of this channel, and thanks again especially to all you patrons that make this content possible. Thank you for your support. See you here.